One idea that I've been exploring a lot recently is intelligence. I came across a selection of essays by Lionel Trilling called The Moral Obligation to be Intelligent. So Trilling was a Columbia professor and literary critic who operated mostly between 1920 and 1960, passed away in 1975, but he put together this collection of essays by himself and other writers from his academic circles that were essentially an argument that you have a moral obligation to pursue intelligence. And he felt that this writing was antagonistic to a lot of the Anglo history and Anglo literature that was most popular. Like in Shakespeare's writings, for example, moral goodness and intelligence were seen as two separate things. And it almost seemed as if he thought that one man could not have both. Hamlet was seen as too intelligent to live. So many of his other writers were described as cunning or as sharp, as negative terms, whereas others were considered simple and good. One such author that sort of fell into this idea at times, was Dostoevsky. So one of the first Dostoevsky books I read was The Idiot, and the main character is one of the most good, noble, almost a caricature of a good human. And the book is called The Idiot. And this character is not very intelligent, he's not very smart, he's not very well read, but he is good. The essays were essentially trying to make the argument that in order to be good morally, you also need to be some degree of intelligent. Because you could have the best intentions possible, but if you don't have the intelligence to foresee the outcomes of your actions, you could cause more harm than good. Like, let's say you are asked to do a task, like you're asked to build a bridge, and you're a very good man, but you don't have the intelligence or the knowledge necessary to build a good bridge, but you want to help people. Sure, you can build a bridge out of good intentions, knowing that it'll help people get where they want to go faster. But if you don't know how to build the bridge well, people could die using the bridge. And so in that example, I think that's a good way of noticing how intelligence and moral goodness can kind of work in tandem. You can have the best intentions, but without being able to see through what those intentions could cause, you have to question the degree of moral goodness you're actually exhibiting. I talked about Dostoevsky, and I've read a good bit of his literature, and one of his books that really spoke out to me was The Brothers K, or The Brothers Karamazov. I loved the book. It was incredibly insightful, one of the most profound books I've ever read in my life. But upon going online to read reviews, I found that the translation I had read of the book was very formal and lacked a lot of depth. So the book was written in Russian initially, and it has since been translated to English. And I came to realize that the book that I read, the English translation, was entirely different in its energy and in its tone than the actual Russian writing. And so I had to ask myself, okay, what am I going to do about this? And so I was like, okay, maybe I'll read some Russian, blah, 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 try and learn a little bit about the language, all of that. It was very dense, but one thing I did learn is that it's very interesting. In Russian, there's two different words for blue. They have a word for light blue and a word for dark blue. When you take a Russian native speaker and a speaker of English, for example, and you put them in a room and you show them different shades of blue, the Russian speakers actually have a much easier time identifying the difference in the shades of blue, just as a function of their language. And so what that means is that language actually affects our ability to perceive things. It affects the way we perceive the world. And so much of our understanding is coded into the language we speak. And so now tying it all together, one area of intelligence that I think is very important to actually pursue is the area of learning more about the languages and cultures of different people. Language and speech, for most of us, is the only window we give others to our soul and to our heart. The Roman Emperor Charlemagne knew many languages, and he famously said, "A man who knows two languages has two souls." This is actually very interesting. They did studies where they had people who speak different languages answer quite different questions in different languages and answer the same questions in each language they knew. And they found that when you ask someone who knows two languages the same question in each language, the answers are actually different, because different languages have different structures and have different culture and different ideology built into them. Like, some languages have words that don't even exist in other languages. Like in Greek, they have a word, pareia, which is a word that specifically means the experience you have when you move into a new place and you're not really settled in and you're trying to meet new people and figure that out. In different languages like Spanish, for example, the word for table has a feminine pretext, whereas in German it has a masculine pretext. And when you ask a Spanish speaker to speak as if they were a table, they usually speak with a more feminine sounding voice and will talk about the elegance of the table and how beautiful the table is. But if you would ask a German speaker to essentially become a table and to speak as if they were the table, they usually come in with a much more masculine voice, and their description of the table is more similar to words such as the table is strong or the table is useful. And so the language you speak and the language you're speaking, even at the moment, will affect your perception of things. Now, that might kind of sound like translating gives you a completely different picture, and that's not entirely true at all. Translation will give you the same general idea, but might leave out some of the details. One way I like to think of it is if you were to give someone an oil painting, a fully made painting of, let's say, a lake, then you were to say, here, recreate this painting, but you were to give them colored pencils. Sure, they might be able to recreate something that you would be able to recognize as the lake, and it might look similar, and you might be able to look at it and say, yes, this is clearly a rendition of the oil painting, but it will have a different finish, it'll have different lines in it, and it'll be clearly a different character of picture. And that's sort of what it's like explaining something in one language versus another. The general idea of it can be the same, but the character of it will be very different. And so knowing different languages essentially allows you to expand your ability to understand the nuances of different people and of those people's cultures. But there's also a lot of actual physical and medical benefits to knowing multiple languages. One example is that children that are bilingual perform way better in almost every school subject, and these differences are recognizable as early as kindergarten. In 2019, they did a study in South Korea, and people who were bilingual or spoke even more than two languages saw a 4 to 5 year delay in the onset of Alzheimer's and other brain degenerative diseases. Another good example is people who know multiple language just overall display higher neuroplasticity. Their brain is essentially more malleable. And this isn't because knowing multiple languages allows you to think outside the box, quote unquote, but it allows you to think within multiple boxes at the same time. Because as I was saying earlier, the ability to think in different languages that are influenced by different ideologies and different values allows you to think about things in much more different ways and directions than you could if you were to only speak one. And kind of wrapping back this language talk into the idea of intelligence, there's one quote, I'm forgetting who said it, but there's a quote that goes like, what you need most is often under the box or the stone that you have left unturned. And so if your goal is to become more complete in your pursuit of knowledge and in your pursuit of a higher capacity to connect with and care for the world, odds are what you need in order to achieve that greater sense of completeness is something you have not explored before. Interesting statistic, but 80% of Americans are monolingual, whereas 40% of people all around the world are monolingual. And so in America in particular, which is interesting because America is a culture and a country that for the most part seems to care a lot about paying attention to what's going on in the world and advocating for things all over the world. The majority of the people don't even know a language other than English or one other language that they know. And so their capacity and our capacity to connect with and really care for and understand the rest of the world is horribly throttled. Now, when it comes to learning and gaining knowledge, there's something called like the knowledge paradox or the information paradox, where the more you know and the more you learn, the more you recognize you don't know. And that's painful. And so for a lot of people, they think that it's not worth the effort of putting the time in to learn a second language or to learn more about other cultures. And they make the argument, well, I've heard this argument from people that I know, that people who know multiple languages know them out of necessity, not because they just wanted to put the work in because it's not worth the effort. And my answer to that would be, going back to the whole moral discussion, if you do feel like you have an obligation to connect with and be there for and to understand the people around you, then learning more about the cultures and languages around the world is your duty. It is your duty to put yourself in a place where you're expanding your lexicon of words and ideas to a place where other people can recognize that you're truly understanding where they're coming from and that you truly recognize and care for the situation they're coming out of. And so, in short, or maybe in long, the idea that I'm talking about here is that we do have a moral obligation to knowledge and to become knowledgeable in many areas so that we can be of use to those around us. So in order to wrap this up, I thought it would be easiest for me to just read an excerpt from the conclusion of a substack that I wrote on this topic. Pursuing more intimate ways to connect with people who speak languages other than your own can be an incredibly powerful indicator of how distant your perception of the world is from others. If you are seeking to become more complete, you must explore ideas and areas that you're not familiar with. We have a lot to learn from those whose perspective and subjective observances differ from ours. However, there is immense risk and vulnerability required when committing to exploring that with which we are unfamiliar. The more you learn, the more aware you become of how much you don't know. But coming to accept this intellectual struggle as both necessary and rewarding is intrinsic to truly growing. If your goal is to connect with people more intimately and expand the scope of your mind and soul, committing time to exploring language and culture is a great place to start. So, as I said, that was the conclusion from a Substack I wrote on this. I am trying to write more on Substack, but as of now, it's been a bit jumbled in terms of the scheduling of when I'm writing. But this is one topic I wrote on, and I have a couple other topics that I'm working on writing on, and some other things I have posted as well. But if you'd like more concise and definitely more well put together expositions of things I've been reading and ideas I've had, my Substack is a great place to go for that. There will be links to that in the description of this, as well as references that I use for this video and for the Substack article.